Hello, and welcome to our first object-oriented example program. In this particular video, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to show you how this all works together, okay? And we'll do some variations of this throughout the video and kind of show you how to keep adding to your class and making things work and accessing class-level attributes versus instance attributes, I should say. We're also going to get into how to import your class. Because one of the things you'll notice, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is that we probably shouldn't have a class in our program. The whole idea is reused across the enterprise, meaning over several hundred programmers potentially working for Procter and Gamble. So we don't want to have it hard coded into our program. We want to import it into our program. And so I will show you how we do that too. All right. A lot of this code is pre-written, so you don't have to watch me write a bunch of code, but we're going to play around with some things as we get into it. Okay, the last thing we did is when we talked about this, we said we instantiated our class. So let's kind of go back and go back and look at what we have done so far. We have this program. I call it example.py. Okay, we're going to have a class employee, mcount equals 0. We have our constructor sitting here. Okay, this is our constructor for the employee. It's going to increment count and it's going to set these variables for me. All right. And then let's see, it's going to, I have this behavior here, this method called display count. Okay. So let's kind of look at a couple things here. Let's see, I'm going to do a little copying here. I'm sorry. Do not pay attention to the man behind the window, because you might not be able to keep up with me anyway. And we also are going to have this thing called display employee, okay? Let me get that there and all lined up perfectly. You guys gotten that error yet where you don't have this thing lined up and it gives you a little red line saying you got to be lined up or it's going to cause a little fit. A dent does not match the other idents, so make sure everything's in order if you have gotten that one already, okay? So in this case here, we're down to our main routine. Once again, this class is separated, just like your functions were in our previous weeks. These classes, they do nothing until they're called. And in this case, a class does nothing until it's instantiated. So I have my main program sitting right here. I'm going to instantiate it. Here's emp1 equals employee. Now, I'm not really sure I love the name emp1. If we're going to use Hungarian notation, probably something like this would be a little bit better, okay? Object obj with a capital just like this. Please start using that for your code in this case here, all right? If I do that, I'm going to have to change some of these others, and I can do that because if I'm going to tell you to do it, I should do it, right? And that's not a problem. There you go. I got a little lazy too in doing this. So, okay, so what's this doing? This one right here is creating this new object called emp1. Okay, we talked about this before. It's going to pass the name Zara, and it's going to take her salary of $2,000. Then we have Manny, who's our second employee, with $5,000. So now we have both of them. Once again, as I said before, every instance is a new instance of variables. Okay, in this case, instant variables, okay, name and salary. So every time we do this, it's almost like instantiating two new variables like you did before, declared two new variables like you did before. So every time we do this, those two variables are being declared. And I can prove that by sitting back and saying, okay, let's watch this work. obj imp1 display employee, obj imp2 display employee. I'm going to do one more thing to make this work. I'm going to go to its properties page of the solution, and instead of starting with employee with class, I apologize for this, I'm going to put example.py. Do not get confused by this. This is basically our startup file, very similar to what you've done in Visual Studio for all your visual programming. Okay, and so let's come back here and let's go ahead and run this thing and see how this all works, see if it works correctly. Okay. Well, it didn't have any input to this one. I don't have any input. So basically what it's doing is name is, whoops, it actually ran the wrong one. Oh, why did it run the wrong one? Hold on for 1 second. I'm going to try one more time. There you go. Should be example.py, save. And now let's try it. Okay, get that out of there. And in this case here, there you go, much better. So In this case here, what it did, let's go down here a little bit. Let's see, let's make this a little bit easier to look at. And there you go. And then let's look at our results here. A different location. There they are right there. I'm going to pull this over here. There you go. So if we sit back and we have our class, it did nothing. We instantiated employee. We put 0 and 2000 in here. We did this, employee. And then what we do is now we can use in our dot notation, we can sit back and actually reference the different things that are in imp1 and imp2. Remember, imp1 is its own data type. It's its own object. And so display count, that method, display employee, that method, and then imp count, imp name, imp and salary are all able to be retrieved based upon me looking at that object. We're using Visual Studio here, right, for this. If you go back and look at your visual pieces, if you recall when you put that text box on there and you said txt first name dot, you saw things like all this little square right there, which represents all the methods that are available for that particular class. And you saw this, I don't know if it's an eraser or a colored in box, whatever you want to call it, that represented all the properties that were available to it. Go back and look at that again. You've been doing object-oriented programming, you haven't even realized it. Now, again, the object-oriented programming that you've been dealing with for the most part has been dealing with GUI-based objects. We're dealing with logical objects, business tier objects, if you will. Okay? Make sense? Okay, so all I had to do is do this, and I can actually reference one of these things if I wanted to. Meaning, if I wanted to sit back and say I wanted to reference the name, okay? Let's do another one here. So if I wanted to do that, that's all pretty cool. Now let's go look at this one more time. So I displayed the employee. There's Zara, and my name right there. That's what it's doing, and it's doing the salary, 2,000, and Manny 5,000. That's what my display employee is doing. It's calling this method imp1 display employee, imp2 display employee, and it's literally pulling in the values of those instant variables, those instant attributes. Does that make sense? All right. Again, when I first learned this, probably what was going through my head is, okay, it's cool, but how do I write a real meaty program doing this? Well, we'll get to that. Right now, you're just learning how to write object-oriented programming right now. So be a little patient with it. And as the weeks progress, we'll do a big application where you write these objects and you put your code and so on in there. Okay? So don't get too weirded out by what we're doing. We're just showing a way of doing something. This is a methodology, a way of doing something, another way of writing our programs. We're trying to take a lot of the actual code that's within our programs and put it into classes so it can be shared among all the rest of the other programmers. So potentially they could use it. When I first learned object-oriented programming, the goal was, that you wrote very little code, and all you really did was call methods of different objects and brought all these objects together. I think that was a bit far-fetched. I'm not sure how you could always just be calling code. They believed that every piece of code belonged to a behavior of some object, and that really, in the end, the only thing we should be doing is calling these methods to make everything work. You can believe that. That's fine. I think there's a little bit of code you're not writing your programs and then calling these methods, but the whole idea is reuse. And their big policy was no piece of code should be written unless it's a class already. So if you're writing a new piece of code and a new piece of logic, make it a class so others could potentially use it. Does that make sense? All right. Anyway, so here you go. So this is pretty much what our first program looked like. We basically instantiated twice with 2 new objects. We populated the data within it, which is name and salary for this instance and for this instance. We printed off the first instance, we printed off the second instance, and then on my display count, this is a little bit different. Display count took this class level variable, class level attribute, and told me how many objects were actually instantiated, because I actually incremented it right here every time we instantiated an object. Does that make sense? And the answer was 2. We talked about that a little bit in the last video. This is a class level. It has nothing to do with each instance. It's the overall class. So let's look at this a little bit differently. Let's just sit back and say, okay, that's all good. Let's add a third one in here. So if I added a third one in here, right, and I wanted to do this, we make it object 3. Let's see what would happen though if I kept it object 2, and we'll call this one Bob, and I want to make the big bucks, so we'll say $8,000. Let's keep it 2. We'll save this, and let's see, we're going to have to end this one right here, and then we'll go back and rerun it. And it actually worked, but look what happened in this case. Because we did imp2, we did overlay. We basically overlaid that information. It didn't keep Manny, it overlaid it. So we got to be very careful with that. If that's what we want to do, that's how you could do it. However, if we wanted a totally different instance, we would make this 3. And by doing that, I can bring this here, bring this down, and say, now show me all 3 of them that are in here. Okay? And we would run this. And here we go. There you go. 2,000, 5,000, 8,000, Zara, Manny, and Bob. And my employee count now is 3. You notice in this case here, even though I do an object 2, I'm saying display count, and I'm passing it something, object 2 in this case, because I got to pass it something in this case, it's still looking at the overall count for the overall objects. It makes no difference which actual instance you call the display count with. Make sense? A little bit of sense? Let's continue on a little bit. Let's look at something else. So say this is all good, but we want to do a little bit. Say I sit back and say, okay, I put in Bob, but really what I meant to do is I wanted to put in Robert. So I do want to change this. So I can go to employee 3 dot name. So that's that particular instance, and now I can make that Robert. Okay, we saw that it was Bob before, but as you can see in my code, I can actually reference that particular property within my code for that particular instance. And if everything works right, he's now Robert and not Bob. All right? Don't call me Robert. There's a whole nun story behind that too. Okay? All right? So that's how you can change different things in this. You can actually change it and your different values and so on as you go through it. So this is how I run my individual methods. And this is how I access those particular attributes, in this case, instance attributes, okay? If I wanted to access instead of running this particular thing right here, employee display count, if I just wanted to access the class level variable, all I really need to do is do something like this, where I'd say print, and we can say employee count is, and I'll do that, and we'll say comma, but I have to reference that employee. Employee dot, see it right there? Employee count, count right there. Let's see what happens when I run this. So instead of me running that procedure from my code, I can reference that employee, in this case, class level attribute. And as you see, it works perfectly fine. So I got Robert, and then go from there. Pretty cool? Now, you're saying, okay, that's great. So I instantiated some things. I called a couple methods. Big deal. Well, you come a long way. Don't say big deal. It's actually a long way. But if my program needs to do a couple different things, I can take those functions that you've kind of developed already in maybe other programs and make it part of my particular class, okay? So once again, a class is an object is a thing. It should have one unique thing, one unique purpose to it. And so if this is an employee and an employee deals with, you know, the count and it deals with its salary and so on, that's what we're actually talking about here, okay? In this case. But if I wanted to do more with it, let's go over to this program right here, if you don't mind. Let's see, here it is, this one right here. And I kind of updated this a little bit more, and I added in here the average, okay? And I can add average in there. Again, we have the employee itself. So if I had the average, I could call display average, and it would take if I took my salary in, okay, and as I did before, and I have my count still, okay, I can figure out the average. So I could call display average salary, and that would work fine too. If I wanted to figure out the salary right here, all I need to do is actually take the salary plus the count, and it would all work pretty well. Let's go back to my example here, and let's see, we have our imp count here. Let's put this here, and we'll say total employee, let's say average employee salary. If I can type, here we go. There we go. And using proper English is, and here we go. So I took the class level variable imp salary and divided by the class level variable imp count. Once again, as we talked about before, you're not going to have a lot of class level variables. Oh, I have a problem. Aren't you happy that I have a problem? Let's see. Employee salary has no attribute imp salary. Okay, there's no such thing. Oh, you're right. I didn't make it yet. Let me go back over here, and I'll be, just for sake of time, I'm going to paste all of this within my example. I think it's good I get a few errors here because you guys are probably happy going, oh, thank God I'm not the only one that gets errors. We all get errors. We all have to debug our code. You don't get upset with it. You read the error message and you figure it out, okay? There's always an answer. That's always the good news. There is always an answer. So in this case here, my answer was I didn't have the variable all set up and defined yet. So let's go back here. Let's rerun this again and see how we do. I still got issues. What the heck? Maybe I didn't update it. I didn't update it. Notice this right there, a little asterisk right there, it hasn't been saved yet. And now it's saved. Let's see if that makes any difference. It does. Okay, so in this case here, Manny, Zara, Manny, and Robert, because I changed Robert over here from Bob to Robert. And now my average, where'd he go? Where's my little thing at? There you go. Let's get back to here. There you go. And my average employee salary is 2, 5, and 8, so that's 10. 15, I divide that by 3. My average is now $5,000. Don't you agree? And there you go. This is your first object-oriented program. You can write different types of methods and so on to do different things with. This type of methods right here can get pretty complicated. You can write very sophisticated code. All the code that you wrote possibly in your last assignment, last project where you had to do quite a few things. Those actually can become methods of an object, and you call them, and you pass the parameters accordingly here. So it's very similar to working with functions. Instead of a function is not an object. It is no unique instance to it. It's all top down. You have to run it the way it is. In this case here, we can do a lot of different things with it. And as we continue on with the course, you'll find out how we can manipulate some of these functions within a class to make it really be unique based upon who is actually calling or referencing the class, I should say, and instantiating the class, and what kind of data is being passed. Not sure if that makes sense to you, but that's all based upon polymorphism, overloading, and so on. And we'll get into all of that as we talk about more and more things with object-oriented. Anyway, this is your first programs. I made these available for you. Please look at these as your template to get started with your own assignments. Have fun with them, okay? We're going to keep building, and hopefully, sooner or later, you'll become a true object-oriented programmer.